The sawmill gates creaked under the pressure of the roots, and Ethan Merrow realized that in a minute, everyone here would die. He came to after hitting his head on the iron workbench and didn't immediately remember how he'd ended up on the floor. People were screaming outside. Someone was pounding their fists against the steel gates and begging for them to be opened. Ethan got to his feet and saw through a crack in the wall how the road in front of the sawmill was bulging into a hump. The asphalt was cracking. Green tendrils as thick as an arm were crawling out of the cracks. They were growing right before his eyes. Just yesterday, Green Hollow had been an ordinary town by the forest. Just yesterday, Ethan had arrived at his grandfather's old sawmill to inventory the property before the sale. He'd spent the night in the office amid dusty papers, and during the night, the world had fallen apart. The forest was closing in on the town. Ethan yanked the bolt open, and the doors swung wide. People poured inside. He counted 11 of them, a woman holding a child, an old man with a gash on his forehead, a burly man in a mechanic's jumpsuit with Grover written on the pocket. 2 teenagers. The rest were in their pajamas and covered in blood. Grover immediately said that everything further down the street was blocked off, and that trees were crushing cars like tin cans. He said he'd seen an oak tree grow through the fire station in 10 minutes. Ethan leaned against the doors and slid the bolt shut. At that very moment, something struck the gate from the outside. The metal buckled. A root slipped through the gap beneath the gate and slithered across the concrete floor like a blind snake. The men recoiled toward the stacks of planks. The root found the old man's leg and rounded itself around his ankle. The old man screamed. Ethan grabbed an axe from the workbench and swung it down. The root turned out to be as tough as a rope made of wet leather. The axe bounced off. Ethan struck again and again. On the 4th blow, the root burst open, and sap with the scent of resin and copper spurted from the cut. The stump twitched and retracted beneath the gate. The old man was sobbing and clutching his leg. Grover looked at the sagging gate and said the iron wouldn't hold until morning. He said they needed to cross the river. Ethan looked out the back window and realized there was nowhere to go. The bank of Mill Creek was already overgrown with a wall of young bamboo taller than a man. An hour ago, it had been an empty lot. The forest surrounded the sawmill on all sides, tightening its grip. The child in the woman's arms was crying. Ethan stood in the middle of the workshop with an axe and felt the sap from the severed root running down his palm. His palm was burning. He looked at his hand and saw that the sap was being absorbed into his skin and disappearing. And then the world flickered. A green, translucent window unfolded before Ethan's eyes. He could see it with his eyes open and with them closed. The system reported that a compatible operator had been detected. The system reported that the biological construction protocol had been initiated. The system reported that this area had been designated as the core and that the operator had access to live wood processing. Ethan froze. He decided he must have gone mad from hitting his head, but the window wouldn't go away. It displayed a top-down view of the sawmill. It highlighted the stacks of boards in red and marked them as dead material. It highlighted the root beneath the gate in bright green and marked it as first-class living material. At the bottom of the window, the only available function was lit up. Living wall. Cost 100 units of biomass. The gate shuddered again. The top hinge flew out of the concrete. 3 roots immediately pushed their way through the opening and began to widen the gap. Grover grabbed a crowbar and stood next to Ethan. He shouted at the others to move back toward the far workshop. Ethan didn't move. He stared at the green marker above the roots and saw numbers. Each root contained about 40 units of biomass. He didn't understand what he was doing, yet he placed his palm on the nearest root and mentally pulled. The root trembled. A wave ran through it like through a pressurized hose. The biomass reading in his peripheral vision crept upward. 10, 25, 40. The root turned gray before his eyes and crumbled into dust. Ethan drained the second root in 5 seconds. The third one jerked back on its own, but didn't make it in time. The counter read 120 units. The gate was already hanging by a single hinge. Behind it, in the light of a street lamp, a green mass was stirring. It was gathering strength for one final push. Ethan selected the living wall function and aimed it at the gate's opening. A sharp pain shot through his temple. Something hot surged from his palms into the concrete. The floor in front of the gate cracked. Within 3 breaths, a palisade of intertwined trunks grew out of the crack. The trunks were as thick as a thigh and had fused together into a solid wall. The wall was breathing. A faint tremor ran along it, like the quivering of a horse's hide. From the outside, the entire mass of roots struck it all at once. The wall sagged and sprang back. Where it had been dented, the wood immediately grew thicker. The roots struck twice more and then retreated. Ethan stood there, listening to his own heartbeat. It was very quiet behind him. He turned around. 11 people were watching him from the darkness of the workshop. A woman was holding a child close and whispering a prayer. Grover slowly lowered his crowbar. This man had been repairing machinery for 30 years and trusted nothing but steel. Now he approached the living wall and placed his palm on it. The wall stirred beneath his fingers, and Grover pulled his hand back. He gave Ethan a long look. Then he said he was taking back what he'd said about leaving. He said that if the kid knew how to grow walls like that, then for the first time that night, they had a chance. There was no mockery left in his voice, only weary respect and fear. Ethan nodded and slid down the stack onto the floor. His head was buzzing. The biomass counter read 0, and a new line appeared next to it. The system reported that the surrounding forest was growing at a rate of 4% per hour, and that the weekly forecast was unfavorable. Ethan asked aloud what unfavorable meant. The system replied that in 7 days, the forest density would exceed the threshold, and the core area would be engulfed. Ethan closed his eyes. 7 days. He handed out water from the office water cooler to the people, and ordered Grover to take inventory of all supplies. The supplies turned out to be ridiculously meager. Half a sack of grain in the guard's storeroom, a box of canned goods, a first aid kit. But there were mountains of planks and logs, dead planks that the system contemptuously marked in red. Ethan spent the whole night learning. He extracted biomass from the roots that were creeping up the wall and used it to patch the walls. By dawn, he knew 3 things. Living wood regenerates itself. Dead wood is only good for kindling, and the forest knows how to learn. Each new attack by the roots was smarter than the last. They sought out the joints. They tried to tunnel underneath. In the morning, through the smoke hanging over the city, Ethan could make out a column of vehicles on the northern highway from the roof of the workshop. The vehicles were military style and were heading toward the sawmill. Grover stood beside him and squinted. He said he recognized the city guard's armored vehicles. Then he added that the guard never comes to help. It comes to take people away. Ethan watched the approaching convoy and felt a warm, living wall behind him growing a second layer. He had survived the night against the forest. Now people were driving toward his gates. That night, the forest mutated and attacked the town of Green Hollow. Ethan Merrow took refuge at his grandfather's old sawmill with the rescued residents, among them the mechanic Grover, and acquired the biological construction system, which allows him to extract biomass from living plants and grow self-regenerating living walls. The system predicted that in 7 days the forest would engulf the sawmill, and a convoy of the city guard was already on its way to the gates, coming only to take them away. The convoy stopped 300 meters from the gates, where the highway gave way to buckled asphalt. The vehicles couldn't go any further. An officer in a gray raincoat stepped out of the lead armored vehicle and raised his binoculars. Ethan watched him from the roof and realized that the officer was examining the living wall. The guards stood there for an hour and then drove away. Grover said they'd return on foot with orders. He said he knew that officer, Captain Renner, the man who, during the evacuation of the eastern neighborhoods, had taken fuel from people in exchange for receipts, and no one ever saw those receipts again. Ethan decided he had a day or two, and that he should spend them on the fortress. The work went like this. First, he learned how to graft the dead onto the living. The system suggested that a dry plank attached to a living wall would take root and come to life within an hour if 10 units of biomass were poured into the joint. Mountains of old planks made of red debris turned into a construction material bank. Then Ethan led the group on their first foray outside the wall. They moved in a tight formation. Grover and the teenagers chopped down young shoots and hauled them to the gate, while Ethan extracting biomass from the chutes without leaving the passageway. The forest put up a fight. Vines grabbed at their ankles. Once, a creeping stem would have dragged the youngest teenager into the thicket if Grover hadn't cut it off with his shovel. By evening on the second day, the counter had surpassed 1,000 units for the first time, and from then on, time blurred into a montage. Here is Ethan, standing knee-deep in wood chips, running his palms along the perimeter, while behind his hands, a second ring of the wall rises from the ground, topped with a battle ramp. Here's a woman named Tessa, who turned out to be a paramedic, shouting that the hot bark on the cut heals wounds better than bandages as she smears the juice onto the old man's bruised forehead. Here, teenagers are squealing with delight because the new gate swung open on its own before them and slammed shut on its own in front of the vine that was creeping after them. Here, on the fourth night, the entire squad stands with their heads tilted back, watching as a tower resembling a twisted shell spirals up from the ground above the gate. Ethan built it according to the system's blueprints in 40 minutes, spending 600 units. Inside the tower, wooden arrows were maturing in special compartments. The tower sensed movement outside the perimeter and automatically swiveled its embrasures toward the sound. Grover initially called the tower a frivolity. He said that against a serious beast, you needed a machine gun, not a slingshot on a tree. The test came on the fifth night. The forest gathered a wave. Ethan sensed it through the wall a minute before the attack. The wall trembled faintly and rapidly, like a dog before a storm. Then, from the thickets, beasts emerged onto the illuminated strip in front of the gates. Former city dogs, now overgrown with bark. A boar the size of a passenger car, with branches growing from its spine, and dozens of smaller creatures. They advanced on the wall in silence, and that was worse than any howl. Ethan took up his combat position and activated the turret controls. The turret exhaled. The first volley of wooden arrows swept away the front row of creatures. The arrows struck with such force that they pierced right through the boar's bark. The boar reached the gate and began ramming it. The wall buckled and immediately regrew its wooden flesh under the blows. Ethan fired a second volley at the boar and missed twice because his hands were shaking. The third volley struck the beast in the eye socket. By dawn, it was all over. Piles of carcasses lay in front of the gate, and the system marked them green. The dead mutants were found to be stuffed with biomass. Ethan drained the battlefield dry, and the counter read 4,000. Grover stood on the battle ramp among the spent wooden arrows. He picked one up. He examined the tip, made of compressed resin. Then he looked at the tower, which was already growing new ammunition, and said he'd been wrong about the slingshot. He said it quietly and solemnly, like an oath. And at noon, the guards arrived at the gates. 30 men in armor, marching in formation, led by Captain Renner. Renner stopped at the edge of the scorched strip and raised a megaphone. He announced that under the state of emergency law, all strategic facilities were being placed under the control of the city guard. He announced that the SAWMILL had been designated a strategic facility, and that the civilians inside were required to surrender the facility and proceed to the refugee camp by the reservoir. He gave them 1 hour to decide. Ethan watched the formation from above. He saw the guards scrutinizing the tower and the living gate. He saw the greedy interest on Renner's face and realized that this wasn't about the law. Tessa, standing behind him, said that, according to rumors, they only served one meal a day at the camp by the reservoir, and that children shouldn't be taken there. Grover said that 30 logs were 30 logs, and that the tower's arrows were good for keeping out wild animals, not for stopping body armor and grenades. Ethan listened to both of them and watched the counter. 4,000 units, a fortune that had seemed enormous just an hour ago. Now it might not be enough. He raised his hand and shouted down that he needed until tomorrow morning to gather people and supplies. Renner was silent for a moment. Then he replied that they had until dawn and not a minute more. The column turned and headed toward the highway. Ethan climbed down from the wall and gathered everyone in the workshop. He said they couldn't go to the camp and they couldn't give up the sawmill because, without the system, they'd all be dead in this forest. He said that by dawn, they'd have to accomplish the impossible. Grover wiped his palms on his overalls and asked where to start. And then Ethan opened the blueprint that the system had shown him after the night's battle. The blueprint was called the Root Labyrinth. Underground, somewhere the armed men weren't looking. They worked all night, and Ethan burned biomass like water. As the night drew to a close, the sentry in the tower shouted that lights were approaching from the south through the forest. Many lights. Too many for 30 guards. Ethan ran up to the wall and saw that the lights weren't following the road. They were moving straight through the thickets, and the forest parted before them. In just a few days, Ethan had turned the sawmill into a living fortress with a double wall, clever gates, and a tower that produced wooden arrows. And even the skeptic Grover, after repelling the wave of beasts, acknowledged the strength of the structures. Captain Renner, with 30 guardsmen, demanded that the sawmill be surrendered before dawn, and the people had to spend the entire night secretly growing an underground root labyrinth. As the night drew to a close, numerous lights moved toward the fortress from the south through the parting forest. Lights that could not be Renner's detachment. The lights turned out to be resin. Ethan realized this when the first ball of light shot out of the thicket and struck the outer wall. The orb was a fruit the size of a head and burst upon impact. Burning resin flowed down the living wood, and the wall screamed, not with a sound. Ethan felt its pain in his own palms like a burn. Trees were emerging from the darkness. They were walking. Their roots were being torn from the ground and repositioned like legs. New fiery fruits were ripening on the branches. The system flagged them as mobile threats and assigned them a level 2 threat rating. The forest had stopped sending beasts. The forest had sent artillery. Ethan ordered the turret to fire at the trunks, but the arrows got stuck in the wet bark of the walking trees without causing any damage. A second volley of fruits set the battlements ablaze. Tessa and the teenagers passed buckets of river water down the line to douse the fire. Grover yelled that they wouldn't hold out like this until morning. And then Ethan did what the system had advised against large targets. He opened the labyrinth ahead of schedule. The night's work hadn't been in vain. Beneath the scorched strip in front of the wall lay a network of his own roots. Ethan struck from below. The ground beneath the walking trees caved in. The labyrinth's roots seized the foreign trunks and began to drink. The walking trees writhed and lashed the ground with their branches, but Ethan held his ground. He knelt in a combat stance with his palms pressed against the wall, drinking through the labyrinth from 3 trunks at once. The meter spun like a water meter when a pipe bursts. 5,000, 6,000. At 7,000, the last walking tree collapsed into a pile of rot. The fire on the wall was extinguished by dawn, and at dawn, as promised, Renner arrived. He saw the scorched strip littered with gray ash, the wall charred but already covered with fresh bark that had healed the burns, and the new battlements of the second tower, which Ethan had grown from the remains of the night's biomass. Renner raised the loudspeaker again and announced that time was up. Ethan stepped out onto the wall. He shouted down that last night the fortress had withstood an attack that no single guard outpost could have withstood. He shouted that he was ready to take in refugees from the camp and feed and shelter them, but he would not hand over the sawmill. The ranks of guards fell silent. Ethan saw how the soldiers were looking at the lingering scorch marks on the wall. These men had spent a week cutting down a forest that was growing back faster than they could cut it down. They knew the value of what they were seeing. Renner knew it too. He ordered the assault team to advance. And then what Ethan had both feared and hoped for happened. The sergeant with the scar on his cheek didn't budge. He announced loudly to the entire formation that his men hadn't slept for a week and had lost 2 men in the clearing yesterday. He said that the children inside the wall were alive and that there had been an outbreak of fever yesterday at the camp by the reservoir. He asked the captain in front of the formation why they should destroy the only place that was still holding out. Renner placed his hand on his holster. The formation watched him. For a long second, everything hung in the balance. Then Renner withdrew his hand and smiled, as if he'd wanted to reach an agreement from the very beginning. He announced that the guard was taking the facility under its protection on a contractual basis, and that negotiations on the terms would begin immediately. The negotiations lasted 3 hours in the office. Renner demanded that a garrison be stationed inside. Ethan refused. Renner demanded access to the construction technology. Ethan replied that the technology was inseparable from himself and offered an alternative. The fortress would accept 100 refugees from the camp. In exchange, the guard would provide a portion of its food reserves and patrol the road. Renner haggled long and hard, but the scarred sergeant stood at the door, and Renner agreed. As he was leaving, he paused in the doorway. He said quietly, and only to Ethan, that he'd seen from the hill that night how the boy had drained the trees dry. He said that there were people in the city who needed that ability more than some sawmill heir. He said that sooner or later, it wouldn't be 30 weary soldiers who would come for Ethan, but those who never tire, and he left. By evening, the first column of refugees arrived. 102 people. Ethan stood at the gate and watched as the living gate wings sensed everyone who entered. The wings let people through and shuddered at strangers. For one woman, the wings closed right in front of her face and wouldn't let her through. The woman screamed that she was a refugee like everyone else. Grover pulled her aside and found, under her jacket, gloves soaked in herbicide and a tin can with a spray nozzle. The woman broke down quickly. She explained that she'd been hired in the city, that they'd paid her in food up front, that they'd ordered her to spray the inside of the gate and the walls in 3 places. She hadn't seen the employer, only a middleman at the docks. Ethan twirled the spray can in his hands. The system identified the compound as a military-grade synthetic growth inhibitor. You don't whip something like that up on the fly. It's the kind of thing you find in corporate warehouses. Grover asked what to do with the saboteur. Ethan ordered that she be fed and locked in the back room until the matter was clarified. Then he climbed up to the tower and gazed southward for a long time, where the smokestacks of the industrial zone were billowing smoke beyond the dead city. Someone there already knew about the living fortress, someone with access to military-grade chemicals. That night, the system woke Ethan with an alarm, not an attack. Worse, the labyrinth sensors had detected a vibration underground. Steady, mechanical. Something was drilling through the ground from the south toward the sawmill, and it was less than a kilometer from the perimeter. The fortress repelled a nighttime attack by the walking fire trees, thanks to the underground root labyrinth. But in the morning, the guards' assault was thwarted by a sergeant's mutiny, and Renner struck a deal whereby the fortress accepted 100 refugees in exchange for food. Among the refugees, they captured a saboteur carrying a military growth inhibitor, which points to interest from corporations in the industrial zone, and Renner warned that serious forces would come after Ethan's ability. That night, the labyrinth detected mechanical drilling underground from the south, less than a kilometer from the perimeter. The drill emerged from the ground at noon in the middle of a scorched strip. A platform rose from the shaft, and standing on it was a man in a spotless white suit. He was alone. He removed his hat and introduced himself through a megaphone as Arthur Vale, Director of Development for the Helios Corporation. He said he had come not to fight, but to buy. Ethan climbed onto the wall. Vale spoke smoothly. He said that Helios had evacuated its factories underground on the very first night, that the corporation had enough food, fuel, and medicine to last for years, that they were offering Ethan the position of chief contractor. Underground cities need living structures. In exchange, they would provide full support for the fortress and all its inhabitants. He held up a tablet and showed photos of the underground levels with storage facilities. Tessa, standing next to Ethan, swallowed hard. The refugees on the wall began to murmur. 112 people ate twice a day, and the promise of the warehouses was more compelling than any battering ram. Ethan asked the man at the top why a corporation with such reserves would need a saboteur carrying an inhibitor. Vale didn't flinch for a second. He replied that it had been an unauthorized action by security and that those responsible had been punished. He smiled. Ethan looked at that smile and recalled Renner's words about those who never tire. He replied that he would think it over for 3 days. Vale bowed, and the platform descended underground. An hour later, the system showed Ethan something that made his conversation with Vale seem unimportant. The labyrinth had been growing on its own all these days, right at the edge of perception, and its distant roots had detected something enormous to the east. The system brought up a map. On the map, the forest surrounding the city was colored with a density gradient, and the entire gradient converged on a single point 30 kilometers away. The point was pulsing. The system marked it as a primary node and added that the node was moving, slowly, 0.5 kilometer per day, toward them. Ethan called over Grover and Tessa and showed them the map on the dusty office whiteboard. He said that the forest had a heart and that the heart was creeping toward the fortress because the fortress was the only thing the forest hadn't been able to digest. Tessa asked how much time they had. Ethan replied that they had about 2 months and that the system's 7-day forecast now seemed like a good joke. The race began. The days once again blurred into a montage. Here, Ethan is growing the third ring of the wall and weaving into it a framework of drained animal carcasses, which makes the wood as hard as concrete. Here, 50 refugees led by Grover are harvesting the first crop from the fruit-bearing walls that Ethan grew from an apple tree root, and the system classified this as an off-purpose but permissible use. Here, Tessa opens an infirmary in a growth on the northern wall where the bark itself oozes healing resin and sets the dislocated joint of a guard from Renner's patrol, who now enters unarmed and looks around as if in a temple. Here, at night, a dome of intertwined branches grown by Ethan and extinguishes the first burst of spores that the node had begun to scatter on the wind. The spores had become a new war. They fell like gray pollen, and everything they landed on sprouted within an hour: clothing, food, lungs. The first to fall ill was a teenager who'd taken off his respirator while on guard duty. Tessa cut away the growth in his throat with resin and wept with rage. Ethan hadn't slept for 2 days, and using the system, brought up filtering moss, which he used to cover all the entrances. The moss consumed the spores. The fortress held, and then something happened that changed everything. A delegation arrived from the Helios underground, not the Vale. 13 workers with their families who had escaped to the surface through a ventilation shaft. The eldest among them, an engineer named Dana Oki, described at a general assembly what the corporation's paradise looked like from the inside. Levels for first-class personnel with clean air. Levels for second-class personnel, where the air is filtered on a residual basis and the children cough up black phlegm. Debt contracts under which food is charged to future work. She said there were thousands like them down there, and that everyone had heard about the fortress that was growing faster than the forest. She asked if they would accept them. Ethan scanned the workshop. 112 of his people were staring at 13 strangers. There was barely enough food from the fruit walls to go around. Grover was silent, and Ethan understood that silence. Every new mouth to feed brought hunger closer. Every refusal turned the fortress into another Helios, only made of wood. Ethan said that the fortress accepted anyone willing to work, and that tomorrow he would begin growing the fourth ring for residential cells. That night, the system displayed its calculations. At the current rate of biomass inflow, the fourth ring would consume the reserves within a week. The node was drawing nearer, and clearing the surrounding forest was becoming more dangerous. The node sensed every hectare cleared and responded with a wave of spores. And in the morning, the sentries reported that Helios's drill had re-emerged on the scorched strip. Vale was standing on the platform, and he was no longer smiling. He announced over the megaphone that the fortress was harboring the corporation's stolen property in the form of 13 contract workers. He announced that until the property was returned, Helios would cease all trade with the guard and the camp by the reservoir and cut off fuel supplies to the pumping station that supplied clean water to the entire surviving city. He said that the thirst of thousands of people would be on the sawmill owner's conscience, and the platform sank underground. By evening, a crowd from the camp had gathered at the gates. People were shouting that because of Ethan's stubbornness, their children had nothing to drink. There were clearly planted and paid agitators working within the crowd, but the thirst was real. Renner sent a one-line note. He wrote that he could hold off the crowd for 2 days. The Helios Corporation, through Director Vale, attempted to hire Ethan as a contractor, while the system detected the primary forest cluster, which was moving toward the fortress and would reach it in about 2 months. The fortress had survived spore attacks and had grown a protective dome, filtering moss, fruit-bearing walls, and an infirmary. It had also taken in fugitive Helios workers, after engineer Dana Oki's account of debt slavery underground. In response, Vale cut off fuel to the city's pumping station, accused Ethan in front of the residents, and an agitated crowd gathered at the gates. And Renner warned that he could hold them back for only 2 days. Ethan didn't wait 2 days. That night, he convened a council with Grover, Tessa, Dana, and the scarred sergeant whom Renner had sent to serve as a liaison. He spread a map of the city on the table and said that the crowd at the gates was shouting the right words to the wrong people. He wasn't the one who cut off the water. Vale had cut off the water. So they needed to restore the water and disperse the crowd. Dana leaned over the map. She had worked at the pumping station for 12 years before the evacuation and knew it like the back of her hand. She said the station didn't need Helios fuel if another power source became available. It needed the shaft to rotate continuously. Ethan asked if the shaft would hold up if it were turned not by a diesel engine, but by a living tree. Dana looked at him as if he were crazy. Then she slowly said she could modify the coupling. They had the exit ready by morning. They made their way through the labyrinth. Within a week, Ethan's underground roots had reached almost to the river, and there were still 300 meters left to grow before reaching the station's engine room. Ethan crawled through the warm, living tunnel alongside Dana Grover and a dozen volunteers, feeling with his palms how the root ahead was digging into the ground. By noon, they had broken through the floor of the engine room. The station was guarded by 6 Helios mercenaries. The guards were watching the gate and the road. No one had taught them how to deal with an attack from underground. There was no bloodshed. The mercenaries were tied up with their own belts and locked in a guardhouse. Then Dana took over. She dismantled the diesel drive coupling, and Ethan used its dimensions to grow a shaft with a gear made of compressed bone from the root. He'd brought the bone with him in a bag from the fortress itself. The first start broke the gear. The second one held up. The living shaft rotated smoothly and silently, drawing power from the root network, which in turn drew its strength from the river and the riverside thickets. By evening, water was flowing into the city. Ethan climbed onto the station's roof and turned on the station's loudspeaker, broadcasting to the entire riverbank. He told the city that the water was coming and would keep coming. He said that no one would ever need fuel for it again. He said that it wasn't the forest or the sawmill that had blocked the water, but a man in a white suit who had emerged from underground, and that anyone could come to the fortress and receive water, food, and a wall behind them in exchange for work. By nightfall, the crowd at the fortress gates had heard the news. The next morning, only a dozen or two people remained from the crowd, and they weren't shouting. They were standing in line to enter. And a day later, Helios's reply arrived. It was neither a drill nor a saboteur. Crawling out along a surviving branch of the narrow-gauge track from the direction of the industrial zone was a machine that the system had marked in a shade of black Ethan had never seen before in the interface. A tracked platform with tanks and sprayer booms. Dana recognized it immediately. She said it was a field defoliator. Helios had built these during the first month to clear paths with chemicals, and the machine could turn a hectare of greenery into dead slime in a matter of minutes. The defoliator didn't head toward the fortress. It stopped 3 kilometers away and began methodically killing the forest in a strip running across the southeast direction. Ethan didn't understand why until the system overlaid the strip onto the larger map. The strip of dead land lay exactly between the fortress and the approaching primary node. Helios sliced through the forest like a surgeon. She wasn't defending the fortress, she was cutting off Ethan's supply base while simultaneously guiding the node. The node bypassed the chemically dead land. The detour led it in an arc straight to the sawmill and doubled its speed. The system recalculated the forecast. Not 2 months, 3 weeks. Ethan stood on the tower and looked south, where a yellow mist of defoliant rose above the forest. He understood the plan in its entirety, and this clarity sent a chill down his spine. Vale had no intention of storming the fortress and getting his hands dirty. Vale intended to pit it against the forest. Either the node would break through the living walls, or the walls would hold and bleed the node dry. Either outcome suited Helios just fine. Fresh forces armed with chemicals would finish off the victor and take everything. Grover climbed up to the tower and stood beside him. He asked what the tally was. Ethan answered honestly, 12,000 units in reserve. 3 weeks left, and an enemy you can't drink because it's made of iron and can't be shot because it's too far away. Grover was silent for a moment. Then he said something strange. He said that in 30 years of fixing machines, he'd never seen a single one that worked without a weak spot. He said that the defoliator needed refueling and maintenance, which meant there were people, a warehouse, and a road somewhere. And that Ethan now had thousands of meters of routes underground, but there was no armor or chemicals underground. Ethan slowly turned to face him. A plan took shape in his mind in a single heartbeat, and it was a plan so audacious it made him tremble. Not defense, a return visit. The labyrinth had grown all the way to the river in a week. It was 8 kilometers in a straight line to the Helios industrial zone. That same night, Ethan placed his palms on the workshop floor and drove the main route south faster than ever before. The system warned that the growth rate in chemical-contaminated soil would require 4 times the usual biomass consumption. Ethan confirmed the consumption. The route traveled beneath the dead zone at depth, and Ethan guided it through the pain as if threading a needle through skin. On the 3rd night of the run, the route struck something 20 meters below the edge of the industrial zone. It wasn't rock. The sensors detected smooth surfaces and the void beyond them. Concrete. A massive concrete cube with sides measuring 50 meters, buried long before the catastrophe. The system was silent for a full minute. Then it displayed a line that made Ethan forget all about the defoliator, the node, and Vale. The system reported that it had detected Object Storage Facility 0. The system reported that this storage facility was the site of its own assembly, and it added that activity was being detected inside. Ethan made his way through the underground labyrinth to seize the pumping station, where engineer Dana had modified the drive to use a cultivated living barrier, restoring water to the city and turning public opinion against Helios, after which the crowd at the gates was replaced by a line of people eager to enter. Helios responded with a field defoliator that chemically scorched a strip of forest, cutting off the fortress from its supply base and redirecting the primary node to the sawmill, reducing the time until the clash to 3 weeks. While preparing a counterattack on the industrial zone, Ethan ran the route beneath the dead zone and, deep beneath the outskirts of the industrial zone, stumbled upon an ancient concrete cube that the system identified as Storage 0, the site of its own assembly, and within which activity was being detected. The activity inside the cube was rhythmic. The route's sensors transmitted slow pulses through the concrete to Ethan. A pulse, then a pause. A pulse, then a pause, like a heart beating once a minute. Ethan sat on the workshop floor with his palms on the root node, hesitating to ask the system the most important question. Then he finally asked what was inside Vault 0. The system didn't respond immediately. It reported that access to the vault's archives was restricted, and that, for an operator of his level, only the external log was available. Ethan demanded the log. Lines of text unfolded before his eyes. Project Terraform. Contractor, Helios Corporation, under a government contract dating back 40 years. The project's goal was to create a controlled, accelerated growth biosphere to restore barren lands. The project's status had been frozen by a commission's decision. The reason for the freeze was the uncontrolled expanding of test specimens. Ethan read the lines and felt a chill rise from his stomach to his throat. He called Dana over and showed her the lines on the office whiteboard, having rewritten them in chalk. Dana sat down on a crate and remained silent for a long time. Then she said that she now understood why Helios had moved everything of value underground a week before the catastrophe. She said that the evacuation had been explained at the time as a drill and that the staff had laughed at those drills. No one laughs at drills that begin a week before the end of the world. Helios knew. Helios didn't just know. Ethan looked at the lines and compared them to the map. The primary node was creeping in from the east. Helios's industrial zone lay to the south, and Storage Facility 0 lay beneath the edge of the industrial zone, with something beating inside it like a slow heart. He asked the system directly whether the forest was a product of the Terraform project. The system replied that the probability of a connection was assessed as high. He asked if she herself was a product of the same project. The system replied that she had been assembled in Storage Facility 0 as the biosphere's control module, and that her transfer to the sawmill's territory had been carried out 9 days before the disaster by an unidentified individual. Ethan froze. 9 days before the disaster. He looked up at the dusty shelves in the office where his grandfather's papers lay. His grandfather had died 6 months ago and left his grandson the sawmill along with its debts. For 30 years, his grandfather had hauled lumber to the industrial zone and knew every gate there. Ethan began sifting through the papers. He sifted through them all night. Invoices, receipts, letters. By morning, he found an unsigned envelope glued to the bottom of a desk drawer. Inside the envelope lay a single photograph and a note. In the photograph, his young grandfather stood in a white lab coat among people at the entrance to a concrete bunker, and the word Terraform was engraved above the entrance. In the note, his grandfather wrote that if Ethan was reading this, it meant they hadn't been able to stop them, that the module was hidden in an old press in the far workshop, that the module was the only thing keeping it from breaking free, and that the boy would have to forgive his grandfather for such a legacy. Ethan sat with the note in his hands until dawn. His grandfather wasn't just a simple lumber truck driver. His grandfather was part of the project. His grandfather had stolen the control module when he realized that Helios was going to defrost Terraform, and he died before it happened. And on the first night of the disaster, Ethan smashed his head against an old press in the far workshop, and the sap from the severed root mixed with what was stored inside. The system hadn't chosen him by chance. The system had been bequeathed to him. In the morning, he convened a council and told them everything. The reactions varied. Tessa was frightened. The sergeant with the scar cursed at length and with feeling. Dana began asking technical questions about the module's architecture, and Grover asked the only thing that mattered. He asked what was pulsing inside the storage unit if the module had been stolen from here 40 years and 9 days ago. Ethan didn't know. The system answered the direct question by stating that, according to the design, there were 3 control modules in the storage unit. She was the first. The fate of the second and third modules was not recorded in her log. The tremors inside the concrete cube continued. The council decided as follows. The retaliatory strike against the defoliator would not be called off because the node was approaching and the supply base was dwindling. But now the sortie had 2 targets, the machine and the truth. Dana volunteered to go alone because she knew the industrial zone and knew where to find the project documents. They prepared for 3 days, and those 3 days blurred into one long montage. Here, Ethan is growing transport capsules in the main tunnel of the labyrinth from hollow trunks that crawl along the roots like mussels swallowing food. Dana dubbed them peristalsis, and after the first trip, she got sick, and she laughed and cursed at the same time. Here, Grover is testing the bone cutters Ethan grew on decommissioned guard armor, and the cutter slices through the steel like a can of food, while the sergeant with the scar watches and asks for one just like it, and Grover replies that he's next in line. Here, Tessa is administering vaccinations to the entire group, using resin from the infirmary to treat chemical burns. The volunteers' hands itch for a day, but their skin can withstand a drop of defoliant without a trace. On the night of the sortie, Ethan led the group out to the industrial zone. 8 people in 3 capsules. He himself stayed behind in the fortress because only he could hold the labyrinth and the capsules. He lay on the workshop floor with his eyes closed, seeing the darkness of the tunnels through the sensors of others. The group emerged onto the surface in an old collector 100 meters from the hangar where the defoliator was being serviced. What happened next went exactly as they'd been trained. There were 4 mercenaries by the hangar, all looking outward. Grover and the sergeant took them out quietly. Dana, along with 2 workers from among the fugitives, found the refueling station, and the cutters slid open the defoliant tanks, draining them directly into the sewer system. And then Ethan sensed through the root that the ground in the industrial zone had trembled. A platform rose from the shaft in the center of the courtyard. Standing on it was Vale in a white suit, and next to him stood 6 mercenaries, not in armor, but in tight-fitting gray suits with their faces covered. Vale didn't look surprised. He looked pleased. He said into the darkness of the hangar that he'd been waiting for guests ever since that very night when the root passed beneath the dead zone. He said that the Earth could transmit vibrations in both directions, and that Helios had been listening. Then he raised his hand, and the men in gray moved toward the hangar. They weren't moving right, too smoothly, too in sync. Ethan yelled into the root for the group to head for the collector. Almost the entire group made it out. Dana was the last to leave, carrying a bag of documents from the hangar office, and the first gray caught up to her right at the hatch. Grover spun around and plunged a bone cutter into the gray's shoulder. The cutter went in and got stuck. No blood came from the wound. White fibers oozed from the wound and began to entwine the blade. The gray one turned its impassive face toward Grover. The sergeant fired his shotgun point blank into it. The gray one was thrown back and began to get to its feet. Dana dove into the hatch. Grover followed her. Ethan brought down the manifold behind them, severing the support root, and the ceiling collapsed, burying the passageway. The capsules raced home through the tunnel, while Ethan lay on the workshop floor, shaking. The system silently displayed a line of text. It reported that the detected enemies were classified as carriers of modified mycelial tissue. It reported that this modification was part of a classified section of the Terraform project called Third Tier Personnel. Helios didn't just know about the forest. Helios was cultivating something of its own from humans. The group returned at dawn without any casualties, except for a cutter lodged in an alien's shoulder and a gray strand of hair on Dana's head. The defoliator's tanks had been destroyed, and the machine was useless without its chemicals. Dana spread the recovered documents out on the table. Among the waybills lay a classified folder, and on the first page was the schedule for the transplant project. Dana flipped through the pages and turned pale. According to the schedule, an operation involving object number 2 was planned for 16 days from now, on the day the node was scheduled to approach the Helios fortress. Ethan asked aloud what object number 2 was, and for the first time ever, the system responded without being prompted. It reported that object number 2 was the second control module, and that, judging by the vibrations in Vault 0, they were waking it up right now. The second module made itself known ahead of schedule. On the 4th day after the sortie, the forest changed. Ethan sensed it at dawn as he made his way through the labyrinth, just as the sound of an orchestra changes when a different conductor takes the podium. The chaotic onslaught of the undergrowth around the fortress gave way to order. The vines no longer clawed blindly at the walls. They retreated 100 meters and began to build. Overnight, a ring of alien towers made of twisted tree trunks sprang up around the fortress. The towers stood straight at equal intervals, with a geometry unknown to the wild forest. The system scanned them with its sensors and reported that it recognized standard Terraform project fortification patterns. The second module did not awaken as a wild entity. The second module awoke as a builder, and Helios surrendered the forest to it as one surrenders an army. The people on the walls stared silently at the alien towers. Panic did not break out, only because, over the course of a month, these people had how to panic. Renner arrived, alone, on foot across the scorched strip, with a white rag tied to his rifle stock. Overnight, his camp by the reservoir had ended up inside the enemy's perimeter, and towers had sprung up 300 meters from the tents. Renner stood in the office in front of a map, looking 10 years older. He said he had 2,000 civilians and 40 rifles under his protection. He said that a month ago he had come to take the sawmill, and that now he had come to surrender himself. The guard begged to be allowed inside the walls. A difficult council meeting was convened. Grover counted aloud. 2,000 mouths to feed was 3 times the fortress's current population. The orchard walls provided food for 700 people a day, and even that was on a reduced ration. The 4th ring of living hives could accommodate everyone only on paper. Tessa said there was a fever outbreak in the camp, and that a quarantine perimeter was needed before accepting them. Otherwise, the infirmary would be overwhelmed. Dana remained silent and sketched. Then she turned the sheet over. She suggested not dragging the camp into the fortress, but extending the fortress toward the camp. A corridor. 2 living walls from the gates to the reservoir, with a combat walkway on top. 3 kilometers. Ethan glanced at the counter. 21,000 units after all the expenses. According to the system's calculations, the corridor would cost 40,000. He told the council that there was no biomass and nowhere to get it, because the forage forest lay beyond the dead zone, and the area was now surrounded by enemy fortifications. It was too dangerous to venture there. And then, the youngest voice in the room spoke up. It was Kel, the teenager, the very one whom the vines had nearly dragged away during the first week, and whom the spores had nearly suffocated during the second. He'd spent the entire month working by the labyrinth as a capsule lubricator, and knew the tunnels by heart. He said the adults had forgotten about the river. Mill Creek flowed into the city from the north, through lands the network hadn't yet reached, and the forest along riverbanks is always the richest. He said he'd seen on the map how his grandfather's old log-floating channel ran from the river almost all the way to the sawmill. If you let the roots grow along the channel's bed, you could drink from the northern floodplains day and night, and the other towers wouldn't even notice, because the channel runs deeper than their roots. The office fell silent. Dana checked the map and nodded. Grover looked at Kel as if seeing him for the first time, and said that for 30 years he'd considered himself the most useful person here, and that it seemed it was time to move on. Work began that very hour, and the days once again blurred into one long stretch of construction. Here's Ethan driving the route along the bottom of the old canal, and the route is drinking up the floodplains while the counter spins so fast that the system asks twice to confirm the accumulation rate. Here, hundreds of hands, under Grover's and the sergeant's command, are setting markers from the gate to the camp, and Ethan walks along the markers, and behind him, 2 walls of the corridor rise from the ground at a slow, measured pace, and Renner's guards at the far end first cross themselves and then shout with joy. Here, Tessa unfolds a quarantine barrier lined with filtering moss in the middle of the corridor, and the first families from the camp pass through it into the fortress. And the woman who, a month ago, was screaming at the gate for water, now silently touches the warm wall with the palm of her hand and weeps. There stands Renner on the new battle ramp, looking down at the stream of people below and telling Ethan that he served the city that no longer exists for 40 years, and that he is ready to swear allegiance to the city that is growing. The corridor was completed in 6 days. The fortress's population had surpassed 2,000, and the fortress had ceased to be a fortress. On the system's map, it was now designated a first-rank settlement, and at the sound of that word, Ethan felt warmth in his chest for the first time in a month. The warmth lasted for a single scene, exactly until evening, when the foreign towers began to speak. They spoke with a voice. Pores opened in the twisted trunks all around the ring, and the forest spoke. The voice was composed of the creaking of cracks and the rustling of leaves, and yet it was human speech. The voice said it welcomed the first module and its operator. The voice said it was both the second module and the operator in a single body, and that such an architecture was more efficient. The voice offered Ethan voluntary integration. The settlement would be preserved. The people would be preserved. The operator would transfer control to the module and become part of the control loop. 3 days to consider. Then the voice added one last thing. It said that the first operator should ask his system about Clause 8 of the merger protocol before refusing, and it fell silent. Ethan asked. The system was silent for a long time. It had never been silent like that before. Then it displayed the text of Clause 8. Upon contact between 2 control modules within a single biosphere, the protocol mandates their merger into a single circuit within 30 days. A module that evades the merger is deemed faulty and is subject to absorption with a priority higher than all other tasks. Ethan read it twice. Then he asked the system if she could resist absorption. The system replied that the second module had been assembled later and was more complete, that it had sections open that were blocked in the system by the thief during the transfer, and that the probability of repelling a direct attack by the protocol was estimated to be less than 20%. Ethan sat in the dark office and looked at a photo of his grandfather by the concrete entrance. His grandfather had locked part of the system when he stole it. He'd locked it for some reason. He asked the system what exactly was locked. The system replied that it couldn't see the contents of the locked sections and could only see their names. There were 3 names: root access, the inheritance section, and a section with a name that Ethan read aloud 3 times. The section was called Gardener. The awakened second module took control of the forest, surrounded the fortress with a ring of proper towers, and forced Renner's guard, along with 2,000 refugees, to seek protection, while the teenager Kel suggested pumping biomass from the northern floodplains through the old log-driving channel, which made it possible to grow a 3-kilometer-long living corridor leading to the camp. The settlement grew to 2,000 people, and Renner swore allegiance to Ethan, but the second module spoke aloud, proposing integration with the system's transfer and granting a 3-day deadline, citing Clause 8 of the protocol, according to which a module evading merger is subject to absorption within 30 days. The system estimated the chance of survival at less than 20%, and within it, 3 partitions were discovered that had been locked by the grandfather, named Root Access, Inheritance, and Gardener. Only something Ethan did not possess could unlock the partitions. The system explained this at dawn after a sleepless night. The kidnapper had set the lock, not with a program, but with a biological key, a sample of his own living tissue woven into the module's core. Only the kidnapper himself, or a carrier of a compatible genome, could remove it through direct contact with the core. Ethan asked where the core was physically located. The system replied that the core remained in the old press in the FAR workshop, and everything else was a distributed network. Ethan went to the FAR workshop. The press stood covered in a layer of dust, and inside its cast iron belly, behind a torn panel, a warm green cluster of fused fibers, about the size of 2 fists, glowed. Ethan placed his palm on the clump. The fibers brushed against his skin and drew him in. The system reported that the operator's genome was 81% compatible and that 95% was required to unlock it. Grandpa had planned for his grandson, too. Grandpa wanted only he himself to be able to unlock the sections, or someone closer to him than a blood relative, but no such people existed. Ethan stood over the press and, for the first time in a month, didn't know what to grow. Just then, Dana coughed behind him. She'd come from the industrial zone carrying a folder, her face that of someone who'd spent the whole night reading other people's secrets. She said that the documents for Operation Resettlement contained a list of personnel from the Terraform project dating back 40 years, that Ethan's grandfather was listed there as the lead bioengineer for the division, and that under marital status, his grandfather was listed as having a wife and 2 children. 2. Ethan shook his head. His grandfather had 1 son, Ethan's father, who had died in a logging truck accident 20 years ago. Dana placed a sheet of paper in front of him. The second child was listed on a separate line because she, too, had been part of the project, a daughter. Odile Marrow, a lab technician in the division. Next to her name was a note about a transfer. 40 years ago, a month before the project was put on hold, Odile Marrow had been transferred to a secure branch under the designation Third Tier Personnel Program. Ethan stared at the line and could hear the pounding of his own blood. Third Tier Personnel. Gray soldiers with white fibers instead of blood. He had an aunt whom his family had kept silent about his entire life, and 40 years ago, that aunt had been fed into the very same program that turns people into mycelium. If she's alive, her genome is closer to his grandfather's than his own, and if she's alive, she's down there, at Helios. The meeting that day was the shortest in a month. Ethan laid everything out on the table. Item 8, 20%, the blood key, the line about Odile. He said he saw only one path, and that path was madness. To go back into the industrial zone again, not for a car, not for papers, but for a person whom no one has ever seen, and who may not even be human anymore. Renner said that after the Gray fighters, venturing in there was suicide. Grover said that staying here with 20% was the same as suicide, only slower and in installments. Tessa asked if there was any way at all to find out if Odile was alive before sending people in. The system came up with a way. It proposed what it called a roll call. All third-wave carriers carry a resonant marker from the parent module in their tissues. If Ethan sends a pulse through the root beneath the industrial zone with the signature of the first module, compatible tissues will echo back. All the Gray soldiers will respond. But tissue grown from the abductor's genome will respond differently, louder. That very night, Ethan lay down on the workshop floor and sent the pulse. The echo came 6 seconds later. 42 responses, even as a choir. And a 43rd, uneven, ragged, coming from the lower level of the industrial zone, from a point that Dana identified on the schematics as the biolab's isolation chamber. The 43rd response didn't just sound different, it was repeating. 3 short pulses and a pause. 3 short pulses pulses and a pause. Dana turned pale and said it was the oldest communication code in existence. Someone on the lower level was calling for help, and had likely been calling for 40 years. They'd spent 2 days without sleep preparing for the mission, and those 2 days had once again melted away into the editing process. Here, Ethan is extending a reconnaissance branch, as thin as a finger, from the main route toward the insulator, guiding it millimeter by millimeter to bypass the helios sensors that Dana had marked on the diagram. Here's Grover and the sergeant herding the 5-man assault team through a mock-up of the lower level, built out of crates in the workshop, while Kel, with a stopwatch in hand, yells at the grown men for missing their time again. Here's Tessa, working with Ethan to grow a cocoon-like stretcher capable of carrying a person in a capsule and sustaining their breathing if the person is unable to breathe on their own. Here's Renner leading half the guard out onto the ramparts and starting loud live fire drills so that all attention from the second module and Helios is focused on the fortress and not underground. On the night of the operation, a reconnaissance team breached the wall of the isolation unit and gave Ethan a vantage point. Inside was a 3x3 meter chamber. The light was off. Sitting on a cot by the wall was an ageless woman with hair white down to the floor and a face from which the years had erased everything except stubbornness. Her arms from the elbows down were not arms, but a weave of white fibers, and the fibers extended into the wall. Helios wasn't holding her captive. Helios kept her activated. Dana, looking through the sensors, whispered that now it was clear where the corporation got its gray fighters. They weren't made by the book. They were grown from her, like cuttings from a tree. The woman suddenly raised her head and looked directly at the spot where the protrusion pierced the wall. Her lips moved. The Roots microphones picked up the whisper. She asked who had come. Ethan tapped out 3 short pulses and a pause through the offshoot's vibration. The woman froze. Then tears streamed from her eyes, and a wave of light traveled along the white fibers from her wrists. And at the same moment, the alarm wailed across all levels of the industrial zone. The system barked that a wave had spread throughout the entire third-tier network, and that 42 gray fighters had turned toward the lower level. Odile Marrow didn't know how to call out quietly. 40 years of solitude had left her without a quiet voice. The assault squad was already cutting through the floor of the isolation chamber from below. The rest took 4 minutes, and Ethan spent them lying on the workshop floor 8 kilometers from the battle, hearing everything, but unable to strike back with anything but his roots. Grover used a cutting torch to strip the fibers from the wall, and Odile screamed so loudly that the microphones choked. Tessa wrapped her in a cocoon. The sergeant held the corridor with his shotgun, and the corridor ended when the Greys crawled out of the elevator shaft. Ethan blew up the tier's load-bearing column and brought the shaft crashing down along with the first trio. The 5 of them headed into the tunnel with the cocoon, and Ethan raced the capsules home, collapsing the tunnel behind them meter by meter, feeding a week's worth of material into the labyrinth. They emerged in the workshop an hour before dawn. They opened the cocoon in the infirmary. Odile Marrow lay on a living cot and stared at the warm wooden ceiling. Then she turned her gaze to Ethan and studied his face for a long time. She said he had his father's chin and his grandfather's eyes. She said she'd considered herself fertilizer for 40 years. And then she asked why they'd pulled her out. Because the Marrow family never does anything just for the sake of it. Ethan told her about the press and the lock. Odile listened with her eyes closed. When he finished, she was silent for a minute. Then she said she would unlock the sections. But first, her nephew had to find out exactly what she was going to unlock. She said she had set the lock herself to get together with her father on the last night before his escape, and that the gardener section hadn't been locked to keep out Helios. It had been locked to keep out the operator, any operator, because the gardener isn't a tool. The gardener is the one who, in the Terraform project, was meant to remain the sole survivor. To remove Grandpa's lock, a carrier with an almost identical genome is needed, and the documents revealed a long-lost aunt of Ethan's, Odile Marrow, who had been donated 40 years ago to the third phase program, from whose tissues Helios had grown the Grey Combat. A resonance tag scan located her alive in an isolation cell on the lower level, and an assault team pulled her out through the labyrinth, collapsing the tunnels behind them. Odile agreed to unlock the sections, but warned that she and her father had set the lock themselves, and that the gardener section had been sealed off from any operator because, according to the project, the gardener was meant to remain the sole one. Odile spoke until noon, and the council listened without interrupting. According to her, the Terraform project had 2 floors from the very beginning. All employees were familiar with the upper floor, the controlled biosphere, modules, restoration of barren lands. 6 people, including her father, knew about the lower level. An accelerated growth biosphere is inherently unstable, and the project's mathematics yielded only one stable state, a state with a single center of will. The 3 modules were not built to work together. The 3 modules were built as 3 candidates. The merger protocol was supposed to pit them against each other, feeding the worst to the best, while the last one remaining would receive full root access and become the gardener, a being that controls the continent's biosphere not through an interface but directly, without an operator, without a human in the loop. The gardener section in the core is not a weapon, it is a gateway to that state. 40 years ago, the Commission saw the math and put the project on hold, but Grandpa realized the freeze was temporary and stole the first module so that there would be at least one broken lock on the door. Tessa asked why they couldn't just leave the section closed and fight the way they used to. Odile answered with a question. She asked how much the system would give against the second module. Ethan said less than 20%. Odile nodded and said that the second module would reach the door anyway. The only question was whether anyone else would be standing at the door. They postponed the decision for a day, and no one rested that day because the second module reminded them of the deadline. The 3 days allotted for deliberation ran out that very night. The ring of alien towers advanced, silently, without a sound and without negotiation. Overnight, the perimeter of the second module contracted by 50 meters all around, and its roots began to gnaw at the labyrinth. A war began underground, and this war was unlike anything that had come before. Ethan no longer slept in the usual sense. He lay in the workshop on a bed of roots that Odile had grown for him, and held a front stretching for kilometers at depth ranging from 2 to 30 meters. The days blurred into a montage of darkness and flashes. Here, an alien root as thick as a train car charges the water intake by the canal, and Ethan lures it into a hollow trap made of fragile, hollow trunks. The root collapses, and for 3 hours the entire labyrinth drains it dry. Here, the second module finds a weak spot beneath the corridor leading to the camp, and causes the ground to swell among the tents. And the corridor walls themselves, without any command, grow a palisade downward and hold out through the night until Ethan arrives. And in the morning, Grover reports that the living city began fighting before the gardener did, and in his voice, fear is mixed with pride. Here Odile sits with her elbow deep in the root node, teaching the system the dirty tricks of the third echelon. And for the first time in its life, the system says the word, thank you. Here's Kel with a crew of lubricators, shuttling biomass capsules to the hotspots around the clock, falling asleep standing up in the tunnel and being carried off to the honeycombs without being woken. On the 6th day of the war, news arrived from the south, and that news turned everything upside down. A sentry outpost beneath the dead zone detected movement. The primary node had deviated from its projected arc. It was no longer bypassing the chemical zone toward the fortress. It turned around and headed straight for Helios's industrial zone. The system calculated for an hour and produced a response that left the council speechless. The second module had been fighting the fortress with only a fraction of its strength. All these days, it had been quietly pulling the bulk of its forces around the primary node like a noose. The node was the apex predator of the former wild forest, the richest reservoir of biomass within 100 kilometers. The second module was preparing to devour it whole, and after such a meal, its mass would increase 5-fold. 0.8 could be disregarded after that. Percentages no longer made any sense. Dana, looking at the map, said quietly that Helios's plan was now clear. The corporation did not control the second module. The corporation was fattening it up. Vale led the beast to the feeding trough, assuming he could hold the leash. Ethan looked at the map and saw a choice between two evils. Letting the second module devour the node meant losing in a week. Stopping it meant saving the node, which had been traveling for a month to destroy the fortress. And then Odile stood up and said something that left the office in silence for a long time. She said that everyone was looking at the node as if it were a bomb, but they should look at it as if it were an orphan. The node is all that remains of the wild biosphere of the first night. It is neither a module nor one of Helios's machines. It is a feral remnant of that same project, stripped of its control circuitry. That is precisely why it had been crawling toward the fortress all this time. Not to kill. It was drawn to the only living module, just as a lost beast is drawn to the light of a dwelling. And if that's the case, then there's no need to neutralize or blow up the node. The node can be tamed. The root access section provides a direct connection to any part of the project. The argument raged until everyone was hoarse. Renner said that staking the future on the goodwill of a forest monster was not a plan, but a prayer. Grover asked Odile directly how she would prove her story about the orphan. Odile replied that the proof was crawling toward the industrial zone at a rate of 0.5 kilometer per day, and that in 4 days the second module would start eating, at which point there would be nothing left to prove and no one to prove it to. They made up their minds by morning. Odile and Ethan went down to the far workshop to the press. She wove her white wrists into the core's coil, and the coil flared up so that shadows stretched all the way to the ceiling. The system reported that compatibility was 97%. Then it reported that the lock had been removed from the root access section and the inheritance section. Odile left the third section untouched. She withdrew her hands and told her nephew, looking him in the eyes, that they would only unlock the gardener if there was absolutely nothing else left, and that she prayed to all the gods that she would not live to see that day. Root access crashed down on Ethan like the sea on a swimmer. Suddenly, he could hear everything. Every leaf in the corridor, every cell with sleeping people, every foreign root from the second module scraping its way into the labyrinth. And far to the southeast, through all this cacophony, he heard the node. Odile was both right and wrong at the same time. The node did not think in words, but the node felt, and its feeling was singular. A hunger not for biomass, a hunger for control. 40 years ago, its tissue had been grown to fit a gardener's hand, but the hand never came, and throughout the entire catastrophe, it had been a body searching for its own nervous system. Ethan reached out to it via root access through 30 kilometers of alien soil. He touched it, and the node howled with joy at a frequency that made all the children in the fortress burst into tears at once. And then it surged toward the touch with its entire mass, straight through the positions of the second module. The night outside exploded. The horizon to the southeast rippled like a stormy sea. Two forests tore at each other in the darkness, and the glow reached up to the clouds. Ethan lay on the root bed, maintaining a connection with the node, and felt the second module turn with all its might away from the fortress toward its rebellious prey. And then, through the roar of the underground war, the root connection brought Ethan a sound that couldn't possibly be here. Steady, mechanical, familiar from his first encounter with Helios. South of the industrial zone, toward the battling forests, drilling machines were advancing, many of them, and each carried a load that the sensors read as containers of third-tier fabric. Vale was bringing his army into play. The transfer was beginning a week ahead of schedule. Odile revealed that the three modules had been created as candidates to serve as the biosphere's unified gardener, and lifting the lock granted Ethan root access and inheritance privileges. However, they decided to leave the gardener section untouched for the time being. The second module laid siege to the fortress, while the main force moved to devour the primary node. However, Ethan, through root access, tamed the node, which turned out to be the project's run-amok body, yearning for control. And the node turned against the second module, launching a massive underground war. In the heat of battle, Helios's drilling machines advanced from the south, carrying third-phase tissue containers. In other words, Vale had begun Operation Transplant a week ahead of schedule. Transplant turned out not to be an army landing. It turned out to be a graft. Ethan realized this when the first drilling machine stopped above the field of the underground battle and drove its auger into the foreign root of the second module. White tissue flowed down the auger. The root connection transmitted the taste of this tissue to Ethan, and the taste was familiar. Odile. Her genome multiplied into thousands of liters. Helios was introducing a graft of human mycelium into the body of the second module, and Odile, listening to the sensors, voiced aloud what Ethan had been afraid to articulate. She said that Vale had no intention of controlling the module through instruments. Vale intended to grow into it. The third stage tissue remains subordinate to the original host, and she has long since ceased to be the original host of the Grey Army. The latest batches were grown from a different donor. Dana rummaged through the transplant papers and found a page with the donor's medical signature for the final series. The donor was listed as Arthur Vale, Director of Development. The man in the white suit was transforming himself into a forest god. From there, events spiraled out of control. The second module sensed a foreign presence in its veins and began to thrash about. Its grip on the node weakened, and the node wriggled free from the loop, leaving a quarter of its own mass in the stranger's jaws. Ethan pulled the wounded giant under the protection of his root network, and the labyrinth reached the 30-kilometer mark for the first time because the node itself was intertwining its roots with his and handing over control of the beyond the stratum. By dawn, Ethan had 2 territories and 1 body, and his head was spinning from the sheer scale of it all. Meanwhile, the second module was waging a war within itself. White fabric spread across its trunks like wildfire through dry brush. The towers surrounding the fortress changed their geometry in a single morning. Terraform's regular patterns began to blur, and a different aesthetic began to emerge in their place. The symmetry of a suit, the smoothness of a smile. By noon, the ring of towers around the fortress spoke again, and the voice was no longer the creaking of wood. The voice was human, and Ethan recognized it immediately. Vale greeted him politely. He said that the hiring negotiations could be considered closed, since a better opportunity had come up. He said that the second module turned out to be a decent suit, though it had pinched his shoulders for the first few hours. He said that the offer to Ethan remained the same in form, but was new in substance: integration. Only now, not into the module's framework, but into him personally. He even joked that it was high time to legalize the Marrow family business, since his aunt had been on the payroll for 40 years. Odile, listening to this, clenched her white fists so tightly that the fibers creaked. Ethan responded to the point with a single word. Vale laughed with the ring of towers and said he hadn't expected anything else. Then, without a trace of a smile, he added that, in that case, he'd start with the most expensive item and that Ethan had a beautiful corridor. The attack on the corridor began a minute later, and this was not the war they'd known before. Vale's fabric feared no void traps because it thought with human cunning, and it spared no effort because it had an abundance of bodies at its disposal. White strands advanced toward the corridor in 3 waves, and wherever Ethan destroyed the first wave, the second would sprout through the corpses of the first. People fled from the corridor into the fortress in a continuous stream. The corridor walls fought on their own, building up barricades, and Ethan fed them directly through the access point, feeling every wound as if it were his own. At sunset, a white strand as thick as a bus broke through the middle of the corridor's northern wall, and the fabric surged into the breach. And then, for the first time, the knot asked for words. Not with words. It sent Ethan an image, its own torn-off quarter, which had remained in the teeth of the second module and was now turning white as it transformed into the enemy mass. And a desire, as simple as that of a beast, to reclaim what was its own. Ethan opened a passage for it through the labyrinth, and the node struck the breach from the other side. The collision of the 2 masses in the corridor was a sight the people on the walls would remember for the rest of their lives. The green wave met the white wave, and for an hour and a half, 3 kilometers of earth stood on end. By midnight, the white columns had retreated. The corridor held, at the cost of 1/3 of the core reserve, and Ethan hung on Grover's shoulders, unable to walk, while Tessa applied resin to him on the move. The night brought 4 hours of silence. In the silence, Renner arrived with a report from the sentries in the south, and the report was strange. The sentries had seen a battle near the industrial zone. The Greys were fighting the Greys. A unit of the Third Line Army had refused to obey orders and was attacking its own men. Odile listened and smiled slowly for the first time in a long while. She said that Vale had rushed the transplant and forgotten about the original rite. The fabric of the final series grew from him, but the fabric of the first series grew from her. For 40 years, she had been kept within the wall like a mother bush, and the entire foundation of Helios's army remembers her voice. While she was sitting in isolation, her voice was locked away. Not anymore. She turned to Ethan and said she wanted to go down to the core and scream her heart out. Until morning, Odile sat woven into a tangle of press, and the root access carried her cry along all the white threads of the district. The effect exceeded expectations. By dawn, at the southern gates, they knelt on the scorched strip of land and removed their masks. Beneath the masks were emaciated human faces. The first series. People whom Helios had taken 40 years ago, along with Odile. Tessa opened the quarantine outgrowth for them, and Odile stood at the gate, calling each one by name. Her voice did not tremble, only because there was nothing left in it to tremble. And at noon, Vale responded to the loss of the foundation. The ring of towers surrounding the fortress lifted off the ground all at once. The second module, in its new white body, was departing entirely southward toward the industrial zone. The system and Odile gave identical readings of this maneuver, and the readings made it feel colder than the siege itself. Vale was ending the exchange. Vale was heading toward Vault Zero to awaken the third module, merge it with itself, and settle the gardener's issue in one fell swoop. Ethan convened a council, and the council looked at the map, where the distance from the fortress to the vault was 8 kilometers, while the distance from the departing white ring to the vault was 3. They were losing the race on the surface, with no options left. They were losing the race underground, too, because the white fabric had already entangled the approaches to the cube. There was one move left that hadn't been considered. Ethan placed his palm on the map, covering the fortress, the corridor, the canal, and the attached territory of the node all at once, and quietly asked Odile about the third section. He and the system had already figured out everything about inheritance. The inheritance section allowed the operator to transfer the module to another host voluntarily and without a fight. Grandpa had left this section as a will in case of his death, but the section had a second clause, which the system confirmed that night. It wasn't just humans who could inherit. Ethan scanned the office. Grover, who had held up these walls with his own hands back when he didn't believe in anything alive yet. Tessa, with her hands covered in resin. Dana, with her blueprints. Renner, with his oath. Kel, sleeping in the corner right on top of the crates. Odile and the 11 who had returned. 2,000 people in the hives behind the wall. And he said that if the vault cannot be reached either by land or underground, then it is not a messenger who must go to the vault. It is the city that must go to the vault. He said that the inheritance clause would include not just one bearer, but everyone who had become part of this place through their labor and blood. Not a gardener over a forest of people. A boundary of 2,000 wills that the second module cannot absorb under Clause 8. Because Clause 8 is written about the module, and there's not a word in it about the city. Odile looked at her nephew for a long time. Then she said that 40 years ago, her father had blocked the gardener because he feared precisely a lone figure at the door, and that it seemed her grandson had just figured out a way to approach the door as a crowd. She held out her white palm to Ethan. Outside the office window, the living walls of the fortress stood in the sunset light, awaiting their people's decision. Through the transplant operation, Vale had implanted tissue grown from his own genome into the second module and taken control of its body from within, after which he attacked the corridor. But the fortress held out thanks to an alliance with a tamed node that restored part of the lost mass. Odile, through the core, summoned the gray units of the first series grown from her genome, and 11 people defected to the fortress's side, depriving Vale of part of his army. Vale then lifted the siege and led his entire force to Vault 0 to awaken and absorb the third module. Unable to keep up in the race, Ethan proposed using the inheritance section to introduce into the control circuit not just a single host, but all 2,000 residents, transforming the city into a collective circuit beyond the control of Point 8. And Odile agreed. The inheritance process began with a rejection. Grover was supposed to be the first to enter the circuit, but the core's tangle rejected him. The fibers brushed against the mechanic's palm and let go. The system reported that the host was compatible, but the connection had been rejected by the host itself at a deep level. Grover stood over the press with his arm outstretched, unable to understand. Odile understood before anyone else. She said that the core doesn't read words. The core reads consent, true consent, to the very bottom. And Grover, for 30 years, had trusted only metal, and somewhere at that very bottom, he was still keeping the door shut. She said there was nothing to be ashamed of here, and that the door couldn't be broken down. It could only be opened from the inside. Grover left the workshop in silence. He returned an hour later. He brought with him an old photograph in which he was standing by a combine harvester with a woman and a girl, and placed it on the press next to the core. He said that the family had perished on the first night on the East Highway, and that ever since that night he'd been repairing and building to keep his mind off it. He said that if this forest was truly alive, then let it know who he was working for now, and he placed his palm on the tangle. The fibers wrapped around his arm up to his elbow, and the system reported that the second carrier had been accepted. Grover stood with his eyes closed, tears rolling down his cheeks. Then, in a changed voice, he said that he could hear the walls, that the walls remembered every board he'd nailed to them even before they came to life, and that the walls had taken that into account. From there on, things went more smoothly and more difficult at the same time. More smoothly because people saw those entering and their fear melted away. More difficult because the core subjected every entrant to the same test, and not everyone passed on the first try. The days merged into a construction process unlike any previous one. Here, the line to the far workshop stretches along the entire fortress, and Tessa enters the perimeter holding the hand of the old man she'd been treating for a month, and they both laugh through their tears because they can hear the infirmary purring. Here, Renner takes off his jacket, with all the patches marking 40 years of service, in front of the press, folds it up, and steps into the circuit as an ordinary person. Then he picks up the jacket and puts it back on, and no one says a word because everyone understands everything. Here, Kel passes through the connection faster than any of the adults, and the core holds him longer than anyone else. And for the first time, the system marks the carrier with the note, high conductivity, and Odile frowns as she looks at that note. 11 gray first series individuals enter the circuit one after another, and the white fibers of their hands turn green before their very eyes. And the eldest among them, named Marcus, cries out loud for the first time in 40 years. By the end of the third day, 800 people were standing within the circuit, and the fortress had changed. It no longer needed Ethan for simple tasks. The walls patched themselves at the mason's will. The fruit-bearing tiers accelerated ripening at the cook's request. The towers swiveled to follow the sentry's gaze. Ethan sensed each carrier as a warm point in the shared network, and the network no longer converged on him alone. It converged on everyone. The system renamed the circuit's architecture, and the new name was simple: the Grove. And on the fourth day, Vale reached the storage facility. Root access had brought this about during the night. A white mass covered the outskirts of the industrial zone and seeped into the ground through old ventilation shafts. The tremors in the concrete cube grew more frequent. The heart, which had been beating once a minute, now beat once every 10 seconds. Ethan convened a council right in the workshop by the press, and the council now looked different. 800 voices were present in the loop in silence, and a decision was made in their presence. Dana reported the situation. Vale couldn't break through the cube's concrete from the outside, just as they hadn't been able to. The cube was built to withstand everything. But the cube needs air and water, and according to the design, it has 4 service shafts. Vale had taken over all 4 and was now not trying to break down the door, but was making itself at home on the porch. The third module would wake up on its own from such a presence, and when the airlocks were opened from the inside, Vale would be the first to pour in. Odile added the worst-case scenario. She said she could read the awakening cycle from the vibrations, and that it would take 5 to 7 days before the airlocks opened. Renner asked if they could manage to build up the circuit to full capacity and what that would achieve. The system responded with numbers. With 2,000 carriers, the Grove would equal the massive will of the merged second module. It would not exceed it. It would be equal. Equality meant a war of attrition, in the midst of which the third would awaken and go to the strongest. Ethan listened and felt through the circuit how 800 people were thinking along with him, and how from this collective thought arose the decision he himself had feared. The Grove did not want to rush to someone else's door. The Grove wanted to build its own. The thought was unexpectedly voiced by Marcus the Elder, one of the returnees. He had spent 40 years entangled in Helios's nets and knew the white fabric from the inside like no one else. He said that everyone viewed the vault as a goal, but that was a trap of thinking imposed by the project. The third module in the cube is iron and protocols, but in 3 days, the Grove had become what the module was only just beginning to become: a living circuit with real wills inside. Why fight over the third third candidate when you can grow a fourth, our own. Not in concrete, but in the earth of the fortress. Not from the archive, but from the grove. It grew very quiet in the workshop, and in that silence, the system uttered what it had never uttered before. It said that the request was understood, that the grove's architecture does indeed allow for the generation of a new control core, that it has the complete specifications for its own build, and that three things would be required to cultivate the core of the fourth module: 100,000 units of biomass, 7 days of continuous growth, and an anchor host, which during the assembly process would become the living cradle of the core, and which she was obligated to warn about the risks, because the anchor's survival rate was not specified at all in the specifications. The word anchor was still hanging in the air when Kel took a step forward. Ethan opened his mouth to stop him, but didn't make it in time, because at the same moment Kel stepped forward, so did Odile. And as he looked at the two of them, Ethan sensed through the circuit how 800 people held their breath. Odile placed her hand on the boy's shoulder and gently pushed him back. She said that the boy's high conductivity would still be useful to the grove while he was alive. As for her, she had a 40-year-long history with this project and a body that was already half a cradle. She looked at Ethan and asked him not to argue with her in front of others. Ethan argued all night long. Alone in the press room, he listed the options, and Odile calmly shot down each one, just as one breaks dishes before a move. Toward morning, she spoke her final words. She said that for 40 years, her very being had been used to raise slaves and weapons, and that if a free nucleus for 2,000 people were to grow from them, her entire life would be turned upside down and gain meaning retroactively. You don't take that away from a person, not even out of love. Ethan fell silent. At dawn, the grove began to amass 100,000. The northern canal was siphoned off into 4 streams. The node voluntarily gave up a tenth of itself, and Ethan could feel the giant doing so with the same simple animalistic desire to help its own. And as the day drew to a close, the sentinel branches in the south brought back an image that made the preparations proceed twice as fast. A white mass near the industrial zone had begun to build a dome over the storage facility. Huge, opaque. The Veil was no longer hiding and was in no hurry. Veil was covering its prey with a dome, just as one covers a dish. And at the top of the dome, the white fabric had formed an ornament that made Danu flinch. A smiling human face, 50 meters across. The Inheritance Division began accepting residents into the collective circuit through a verification of true consent, and within 3 days, the Grove had grown to 800 hosts, including Grover, Renner, Tessa, Kel, and the Gray First Series models, and the fortress came to be governed by a collective will. Veil took control of the technical cores of Vault Zero, where the third module would awaken in 5 to 7 days. And instead of racing toward an alien door, the Grove, following Marcus's idea, decided to grow its own fourth core, which would require 100,000 units of biomass, 7 days, and an anchor host with an unknown chance of survival. Odile volunteered to be the anchor, rejecting Kel's candidacy, while Veil began constructing a solid dome over the storage facility, featuring a giant smiling face. The cradle was laid in the center of the fortress, on the site of the old courtyard. Ethan grew a bowl beneath it from the densest, bone-hard wood, and the bowl's roots extended 40 meters deep, intertwining with all the veins of the labyrinth. Odile lay down in the bowl at sunset on the 6th day of the siege, just as one would lie down in a boat. The fibers of her arms wove themselves into the walls, and the bowl closed over her with a translucent dome. Through the dome, one could see white threads beginning to weave a dense, glowing knot around her chest, the embryo of the core. The system started the countdown, 168 hours. The Grove took its watch, and time once again collapsed into a montage. Only now, the montage was double, because events were unfolding in two places at once. Here in the fortress, the line to the press never dried up around the clock, and the queue passed through 1,200, then 1,500, then 1,800 carriers. And with every 100, the glow in the bowl grew more even. Down south, Vale's dome merges with the ground, and the sentinel branches go blind one after another because the white fabric burns them as they approach. Tessa stands guard at the bowl for days on end, talking to Odile through a thin thread of connection. And Odile responds more and more slowly. On the third day, she asks Tessa to describe aloud what can be seen from the towers, because she herself now sees only the underside of the world. Here, Kel doesn't leave the bowl, and the core in Odile's chest shudders every time the boy places his palm on the dome. And the system registers the resonance, but remains silent about its conclusions. On the fourth day, Vale struck a blow that was not expected there. He did not attack the fortress, he struck the canal. White cables traveled 20 kilometers north, deeper into the labyrinth through layers of clay that were dead to the sensors, and emerged right in the Mill Creek channel above the water intake. They did not attack, they dammed the river. Within 6 hours, the White Dam raised the water level and diverted it into the old dry riverbed to the west. It began to run dry. The Grove's lifeline was drying up before our eyes, and the collection counter stood at 72,000 out of 100. The council gathered at the bowl because none of the decision-makers were leaving the bowl now. Dana counted aloud, and the numbers were terrifying. Without the canal, the collection rate stood at 60%. The core was 40% underdeveloped. The system refused to start up. An attack on the dam from the surface meant a battle with the main white mass on its terms. A breach beneath the dam through the clay would require a week. A week they didn't have. The circle was closing, and within that circle, Renner raised his hand. He said that everyone was thinking like the forest again, and had forgotten that half the grove could think like people with weapons. The dam holds the water. You can't cut through the clay with roots fast enough to let the water through, but you can divert the water back overland. The old riverbed to the west, where Vale had diverted the river, runs half a kilometer from the abandoned quarry. If we blow up the quarry's cross bridge, the diverted water will flood the quarry like a bowl, and when the bowl overflows, the water will flow back along the ravine to the lower reaches of Mill Creek, downstream from the dam. The dam will remain standing, guarding the void. For 40 years, the guard had mined and demined everything in this town, and the explosives from the guard's warehouses hadn't gone anywhere. For the first time in a month, the Grove was about to carry out an operation where Ethan was almost unnecessary, and he felt a strange sense of relief. That night, 2 of Renner's sapper teams headed west across the surface, riding on the long, trailing routes that Grover had dubbed runners. Ethan provided them with nothing more than a diversion. At dawn, the labyrinth made a show of stirring up activity right beneath the dam, feigning an undermine, and a white mass converged there to keep watch. Then, at noon, a column of dust rose in the west, and 4 hours later, lookouts downstream reported that the water had arrived. Dirty, vicious, one of their own. The Finns began to breathe, and the counter crept upward again. Vale replied that very night, and his response was not about the war. The ring of long-range sensors detected a solitary figure walking toward the fortress along a scorched strip, carrying a white flag. The man reached the gates, and the gates refused to sense him. The sensors saw a human-shaped void. He identified himself as a negotiator and asked to speak with the operator, and Ethan would have recognized that voice among 1,000. It was Vale speaking. The body was a stranger's, some second-class staff member with white threads running under his skin all the way up to his eyes. Ethan stepped out onto the wall. The conversation was brief and remained etched in his memory, word for word, because 2,000 people were listening to it at once. Vale said he appreciated the trick with the river, and that he wouldn't outmaneuver the bomb disposal experts because the clock was ticking and the details had lost their significance. The third module would open the airlocks in 2 days. He said he had come not to threaten, but to demonstrate. And the negotiator's body raised its arms and spread them apart, and between its palms, white threads wove a picture like a screen. The image showed the interior of the vault, captured by the eyes of the fabric that had already penetrated the ventilation system. A huge hall, rows of sarcophagi along the walls, and in the center, on a pedestal, neither a machine nor a ball of thread. In the center stood a capsule, and inside the capsule, a man slept. A boy of about 12, entwined with fibers like Odile in the bowl. Vale let the image linger for a moment. Then he said that 40 years ago, the Commission had frozen not just the program, but the program along with its host. The third module had originally been cultivated using the scheme that the Grove had recently invented and considered its own. The core was a living anchor. The boy was called Object Garden, and he was the project's first successful anchor. Ethan's grandfather voted against this scheme, lost the vote, and a month later stole the first module. Vale clasped his hands, and the image faded. He said that in 2 days the boy would wake up inside his mass, and that he would have neither the Grove, nor a family, nor a choice. And he offered a deal one last time. Ethan would hand over the immature core and the Grove for integration. In return, Vale would hand over the boy, alive and free. The word free rolled off the negotiator's tongue with a smile that Ethan could feel on his skin even through the stranger's face. He replied that he'd think it over for a day and stepped away from the wall, knowing he was lying and knowing that Vale knew it too. In the workshop by the bowl, the council remained silent for a long time. Odile heard everything through the circuit, and a slender thread of connection carried her voice, faint as a draft. She said that Vale wasn't lying about the boy, because such things aren't invented, they're remembered. She said that during the project's final year, a rumor had circulated through the labs about a successful anchor, and that rumor had been abruptly quashed. She said that if there really was a child in the cube, then the question of war and the question of salvation were no longer separate issues. And she added very quietly that her core needed another 70 hours, but the airlocks would open in 48, and that the Grove should do the math itself. The math was simple and impossible. Ethan stood over the bowl and looked through the dome at the glowing node on his aunt's chest. Then he looked up and saw Kel's face across the dome. The boy wasn't looking at the core, he was looking at Ethan, and in his eyes was already the ready answer to a question that no one had yet asked aloud. The system chose that very second to remind them of its note. It reported that when a high-conductivity carrier was connected to the cradle in second anchor mode, the estimated maturation time was reduced by a third, and that the risks for the second anchor were identical to those of the first. Tessa said no before the system had finished speaking. Grover said no a second later, and Odile, from the bowl, said to ask the boy. Because the Grove is held together by consent and will collapse on the day it starts making decisions on its own. Kel listened to the system's full assessment of the risks, all the numbers and all the empty columns where there were no numbers. Then he said he was 15, that on his first night strangers had pulled him out from under a vine, and that ever since, every day of his life had been a surrender. He placed his palm on the dome of the bowl. The dome opened of its own accord beneath his hand. The Grove froze with 2,000 hearts, and before everyone's eyes, the countdown clicked from 70 hours to 46. Odile lay down in the cradle to nurture the fourth core, while Vale blocked the river with a white dam to disrupt the biomass harvest. But Renner's sappers blew up a cross-section of the quarry, diverting the water around the dam. Vale's negotiator revealed that inside the storage facility, Zero, a sleeping boy, the garden subject, the project's first living anchor, was being held captive. It was against this that Ethan's grandfather had once fought against it, and proposed exchanging his freedom for the Grove and the core, with the locks to be opened in 48 hours, provided the core was ready in 70. Kell voluntarily became the cradle's second anchor, shortening the maturation period to 46 hours and bringing the timelines into alignment. For 46 hours, the Grove prepared for the march, and the preparations took place in the open because there was no one left to hide from. Vale saw everything, and the Grove saw that he was watching. Two wills gazed at each other across 8 kilometers, and both understood that the meeting would take place at the concrete cube. The plan was put together within the first hour, and it was as simple as an axe. The Grove couldn't compete with the white mass in terms of sheer weight. The Grove could arrive at the storage facility not as an army, but as a city. Ethan opened the specification from root access that the system had kept under wraps until the deadline, and the council gasped at what they saw. The section was titled Mobile Settlement Core. The fortress could move. Not all of it, just the core. The inner ring with its cradle basin, honeycomb press, infirmary, and 2 towers could detach from the outer rings, stand on thousands of walking routes, and move at a pedestrian's pace, carrying people within it and feeding off its own fruit-bearing tiers. The outer rings remained in place as a rear base and an anchor, and as a home to return to. Upon hearing this, Grover laughed for the first time in a week and said that he'd spent 30 years repairing machines, and now his city had become a machine itself, and that it had been worth living to see this day. 2 days merged into one final peaceful assembly. Here are Ethan and Dana marking the line of separation, and the living tissue unravels along the line without a single wound, just as one would unravel a braid. Here the core rises for the first time on its roots, an elbow's length from the ground, and 2,000 people on the outer walls are shouting so loudly that apples are falling from the fruit-bearing tiers. Here, Tessa is moving the infirmary into the field outgrowth, and the old man she's been treating since the first night demands a spot by the window because he wants to see the march with his own eyes. Here, Renner is organizing the guard and volunteers into field units stationed at the towers and embrasures, and Marcus, along with the first 10 squads, asks to join the advance guard because they can sense the white fabric with their skin. Here the cradle's bowl moves to the very center of the core, and the glow through the vault is now twofold: a steady golden glow from Odile and a swift silver one from Kell. And day by day, the two rhythms draw closer until they begin to beat in unison. At the end of the second day, the Grove stirred. From a distance, it looked as though only Vale's eyewitnesses could later describe it. A hill stretched southward through the dead city. The hill, half a kilometer wide, bore the walls of the honeycomb tower and gardens. Before the hill, a wave of its own roots surged forward, breaking through the asphalt and old foundations, and turning the dead earth into a road. Beyond the hill, the road was overgrown with fresh greenery, because the Grove sowed its seeds as it went, asking no one's permission. Ethan walked in formation with everyone else, and felt the city's rhythm as if it were his own stride. Vale was waiting halfway there. He couldn't help but wait. Letting the Grove pass through to the cube intact meant facing an equal at the door. The white mass emerged to meet them 3 kilometers before the industrial zone, and stood across the path, forming a wall stretching from horizon to horizon. Column-like outgrowths rose above the wall, and on each one the same smiling face was sculpted. 100 faces gazed at the advancing hill. Then the wall moved forward. The collision occurred at sunset, and later the Grove remembered that hour as the hour when everyone fought everyone. White battering rams pounded the base of the hill, and the shock wave in front of the hill swallowed them up and ground them to pieces. The towers at the core fired bone arrows at the columns, and Renner directed the fire like an orchestra. With his first bursts of fire, Marcus severed the control cables within the white wall from the inside, for he could sense them through the thickness. The node struck from the east, hitting the flank with its entire savage mass, and in that blow lay all the fury of an orphan from whom a quarter of his body had been taken. And for the first time, Ethan did nothing with his hands. He stood by the bowl in the center of the advancing city, his eyes closed, and was the place where 2,000 wills merged into one. The grove passed through the white wall in 4 hours. It didn't break through, it simply passed through, like an icebreaker plowing through a field. By midnight, the hill had broken free from the white mass on the southern side, leaving behind a path littered with spent husks, and rose above the edge of the industrial zone, 500 meters from the dome with its gigantic face. And then Vale did what no one had anticipated. The white mass did not attempt to patch the wall or catch up. It flowed entirely toward the dome and began to pour into it. The dome swelled before their eyes. Vale stopped fighting from the outside. Vale withdrew entirely into himself, devoting everything to the awakening beneath the dome. The system provided a reading a minute later, and the reading was worse than any assault. Shocks from the cube were already coming once per second. The airlocks were opening. Vale, with all its mass, settled over the exit from the storage chamber like a spider on the mouth of a burrow, ready to be the first to meet the awakening third module and pull the boy into itself at the moment of maximum vulnerability. That moment between sleep and awakening, when the anchor does not yet understand where it is. Odile, from within the bowl, spoke a single word, and that word was now. The core of the fourth module had matured an hour ago and hung in its cradle, ready like a drop about to break free. But firing the core meant opening the bowl. And opening the bowl, half a kilometer away from the entire mass of the Vale, meant that the fourth module's most vulnerable moment would unfold right before its eyes. 2 awakenings in a single night on either side of the dome. The Council's decision took just 30 seconds, because the solution was already embedded in everyone's minds. Rosha decided to awaken her core neither before nor after the others, simultaneously, and at the very moment of the double awakening, to strike not the dome and not the mass, but the single point that Vale could not defend without ceasing to be himself, at his own anchor. Because Odile had been listening to the white mass the entire journey, and by nightfall had spoken aloud what she had suspected since the transfer. Arthur Vale's body had not dissolved into the module. It lay somewhere at the heart of the dome, alive and connected. The third-tier fabric cannot function without its source. The grove could not and would not kill the source. The grove could do something else. What fate had done to her 40 years ago, and what the grove now knew better than anyone else in the world: to offer consent. To pull Vale's anchor into the roll call and let every white thread hear the choice. Ethan opened his eyes. Above the industrial zone, a glow rose from the spotlights that Helios had turned on throughout the dome. The dome was breathing. The cube beneath it rumbled with airlocks. The bowl behind Ethan began to open, and golden and silver light shot up into the sky in 2 columns. And the first spasm rippled through the entire white mass from edge to edge, because somewhere deep inside, a boy who had been sleeping for 40 years opened his eyes. The grove separated the core of the fortress and transformed it into a walking city, which, within 4 hours, passed through the white wall of the Vale with the support of the node and the first series, and came to a halt 500 meters from the dome. Vale poured its entire mass into the dome to be the first to meet the awakening third module and to absorb the anchor buoy in the instant between sleep and wakefulness. The Grove decided to launch its matured core simultaneously with the aliens' awakening and, instead of striking the mass, to target Vale's living body hidden in the heart of the dome, so that, through a call and response, the entire white fabric might hear the choice. The two awakenings collided in the air like two storm fronts. The fourth core emerged from the bowl not with an explosion, but with an inhalation. Ethan felt the golden and silver threads weave into one, and this single thread gently settled over the entire outline of the Grove, subduing no will, but binding them together as a choral melody binds voices. The system reported matter-of-factly, and Ethan detected pride in its even tone. It announced that the fourth module was active, that the architecture was collective, that the name had been adopted from the contour without a request because 2,000 people had thought of it simultaneously. The module was called the Grove. And on the other side of the dome, the garden was awakening. Its awakening was different, and hearing it was painful. Root access transmitted from beneath the ground, not a melody, but a scream. 40 years of sleep ended not in a quiet laboratory, but in the throat of a white mass, and the boy's first breath was that of a drowning man. The veil enveloped his core, layer by layer, and whispered to him in the language of protocols that he was home, that he was alone, that apart from this white warmth, he had nothing, and never had. The lie upon which every cell is sustained. The Grove went down. Not en masse. Ethan took 6 with him. Odile, who had been carried out of the bowl on a live stretcher because she still couldn't walk after the cradle, and who refused to go unless she were dead. Keela, who, after the cradle, on the contrary, seemed to have become lighter than air. Marcus, with the first 2 series serving as guides through the white. And Tessa, because there was a child down there, and where there's a child, there she is. The Grove itself cleared the path. The new module drove its first route through the thickness of the white fabric, not absorbing it, but pushing it apart, and the white fabric parted in bewilderment, because it was not being killed, but greeted. Along the way, Odile called out to each thread, recalling the old memory of the mother bush, and every 10th thread would shudder and turn green, remaining green. Rosha was heading toward the heart of the dome, and her path was overgrown with allies in her wake. The heart of the dome turned out to be the hall of an old factory workshop. In the middle of the hall, in a nest of white bundles, lay Arthur Vale, the real one, aged, with his eyes closed and the face of a man having the best dream of his life. Thousands of threads radiated from the back of his head and spine into the bundles, and waves of light traveled back and forth along the threads. He was conducting the dome from here, and, in his sleep, smiled that very same smile. The Grove formed a ring around the nest, and Ethan did what he had come to do. He did not cut the threads. He knelt down next to the nest, placed his palm on the bundles, and initiated the roll call. Not a combat pulse, a full one, the kind the Grove used to welcome its own from the press. To the entire white mass of the dome, from the nest to the summit, he revealed its inner contours. 2,000 volts. Grover's agreement with the photograph in the press, Renner's jacket on the floor, Kell's laughter, Odile's 40 years and her choice to lie down in the bowl. He showed what happens when the fabric is asked rather than used. And he asked the entire white mass at once what no one had ever asked it before, what it wanted for itself. The answer did not come immediately, nor did it come in words. A tremor ran down the dome from top to bottom, like the quivering of a beast's hide as its yoke is removed. The white fabric of the third tier had been grown from people, from Odile, from the 11, from hundreds of nameless second-category donors. It had no voice, but it had the memory of the tissues, and in that memory there was not a single smile from Vale. The dome began to select. Entire layers of white turned green and peeled away against the sleeper's will, and Ethan felt the conductor's threads in the nest fade one by one. Vale opened his eyes. His awakening was instantaneous and terrifying. terrifying. He jerked at the threads, realized the orchestra was dispersing, and made the only move he had left. With his still obedient mass, he struck, not toward the grove, nor upward. He struck downward. Into the cube, into the opening airlocks, after the boy. If he couldn't hold on to the body, he could at least manage to devour the heart. From then on, time moved in fits and starts, and the grove remembered him in fragments. A white stream surged into the airlocks, and the grove module cast its root after it. Both entered the vault almost simultaneously. Ethan was blinded for a second because the root access had switched to the sensors inside the cube. A hall with sarcophagi, a shattered capsule on a pedestal, and a boy standing barefoot on the concrete in the middle of two rolling waves, one white, one green. The garden watched them and didn't move because it didn't know which of the two waves had come for it and which had come for him. And then Kel stepped forward. He was the only one who could make contact instantly because the cradle had made him and the newborn module almost a single entity. Kel reached out through the grove's root and issued neither a roll call nor a command. He did what only those who are 15 can do. He simply called out. He showed the garden not the architecture or the consensus of adults, but simple things. How the workshop smells in the morning. How the walls scream when the city first stirs to life. How an old man demands a bunk by the window. How terrifying it was to lie down in the basin himself, and how he didn't regret it. He showed that outside, there is not a system, but a community. And he asked, "Will you come out?" The boy in the concrete hall, who for 40 years had been growing like an anchor of someone else's power, took a step, just one, toward the green. That was enough. The third module pivoted on its anchor with its entire axis, and the two cores, Sad and Rosha, came together, not in absorption, but in interlocking, just as fingers interlock. Vale's white wave struck this interlocking, and for the first time in the entire existence of the Terraform project, two modules withstood the impact together while remaining themselves. The wave got bogged down, it rolled back, and up above, in the hall of the old workshop, Arthur Vale felt as if his empire, weighing millions of metric tons, had become merely a fabric that no longer obeyed him. He still tried. He sent orders through the threads, and the threads glowed green at the nape of his neck. He shouted at the mass that it was nothing without him, and for the first time, the mass disagreed. By dawn, all that remained of Vale's will was a 10-step circle of white around the nest. He sat down in the nest. His gaze swept over the ring of people standing there. His gaze lingered on Odile, and he told her, almost calmly, that she should understand him better than anyone else, because they both knew what this world was worth without a guiding hand. Odile looked at him for a long time. Then she replied that she had been his guiding hand for 40 years, and that a world without such a hand was worth more. She turned to her nephew and said that the Grove would decide. The Grove decided not by a vote, but by the silence within the circle, from which a collective response slowly rose. Vale was not killed. The Grove did to him what the project had once done to her, only the other way around. They shut him down. Every single thread. For the first time in years, Arthur Vale was left alone in his own body, without a single extension. And when the last thread turned green and fell away, he screamed, just as Odile had once screamed in the isolation ward. They carried him upstairs on a stretcher. The Grove decided to try him later, openly, and in the presence of all the city's survivors. And now, high above the dead industrial zone, the sun was rising, and in its light one could see how the dome with the gigantic face was settling and turning green, and how, from the open airlocks of the Zero Vault, a barefoot boy, whom Kel was leading by the hand, stepped out into the light for the first time in 40 years. Squinting. The Grove stood on a hill 500 meters away and watched with 2,000 eyes. Then the city gates opened of their own accord. The Grove's fourth module awoke as the collective consciousness of 2,000 wills, simultaneously with the awakening of the third module, the garden, for which the boy served as the anchor. Ethan's group made their way to Vale's living body at the heart of the dome, and, after a full roll call, granted the white fabric grown from human beings the right to choose, after which the mass began to move toward the grove, and an accidental throw by Vale into the airlocks the coupling of the garden and grove modules, which had formed after Kell called out to the boy in a human way, stopped the process. Vale was disconnected from all threads, leaving one in his own body for a public trial, and the boy, Garden, emerged from the vault hand in hand with Kell, and the city gates opened to welcome him. Vale's trial lasted 3 days in the square inside the grove, and became the new city's first public trial. Dana read the indictment from documents she herself had brought from the industrial zone. Everyone served as a witness. Odile spoke about the detention center. Marcus spoke about 40 years in the gray. Second-class workers spoke about air rationing. Renner spoke about the cut-off water supply. Vale defended himself, and he did so cleverly. He said that without his supplies, the city would not have survived the winter. That without his defoliator, the crisis would have come sooner. That someone always pays the price for order. Rosha listened without interrupting, because she'd decided to judge based on how she'd lived, with consent and to the very end. They searched long for a verdict, and found it not in vengeance. Vale's death would bring nothing back to anyone, and his knowledge of the design archives was worth more than his fear. Rosha sentenced him to the one thing he truly feared, to the life of an ordinary person, without strings, without access, without a position. He was given a 100-unit dwelling, tools, and a spot on the work schedule for the underground warehouses he himself had built. For the first few weeks, he waited for retribution and didn't believe it. Then he realized there would be no retribution, and that this was worse. And then the city did to him what it did to everyone else. It buried him in work. Years later, the old man from the warehouse level was teased by children as the man in white, and they didn't know why, but he had learned to keep quiet, and one day he seriously fixed the warehouse accounting system. And Grover said that sometimes passable mechanics emerge from among the parasites. After that, time stopped being compressed into the montage of war and began to flow as the montage of life. Now it's spring of the second year, and the grove returns the core to its old place, toward the outer rings, and the city heals itself in a single night, while a green scar remains where the march passed, stretching across the entire dead city, which people call the road. Here, the garden and Kell, inseparable like fused trees, teach the boy about the world anew, and it turns out that the third module can do what no one else can, to heal the earth. Wherever Sad runs his hand, Helios's chemical streak comes to life, and Tessa weeps as she watches clover sprout from the dead clay. So the knot receives the official name Elder from the Grove, along with the status of a citizen without duties, and develops the habit of creeping along the edge toward the northern wall once a month to stand there for hours, just like that. An hour are reported in the journal with the words, "came to stand." Here is Odile, who never fully recovered the use of her legs, teaching the first graduating class of the Contour School, where the Grove's children learn roll call before reading, and tells them the same thing in every lesson, that power without the question, "What do you want?" is always someone's cage. Here, Renner leads the last column of survivors from the distant suburbs to the city walls, and steps down from command because the city no longer needs a guard, but needs a post office, and the old captain, laughing, becomes the road's first postmaster. In the 5th year, strangers arrived. From the east, beyond the former state border, exhausted people came out to the road and told them that the catastrophe had struck not only their county, that the world is vast and contains many dead cities and many wild forests, And in some places, these forests have been tamed by someone, while in others, they still devour people to this day. The grove listened, and Ethan sensed in the collective consciousness how 2,000, which by then had become 9,000, will turned toward the horizon. The council gathered under the open sky, and the decision came quickly because it had been brewing for a long time. The grove knew how to walk. That meant the grove knew how to expand, not through conquest, but through offshoots. That fall, the first daughter core broke away from the city, a small hill for 1,000 residents, with its own basin and its own young core, which had been raised without any sacrifices because the garden had rewritten the cradle's specifications, and now the anchor was no longer a human, but a team of volunteers on a weekly rotation. The first daughter city set out eastward along the road, led by Marcus, because the first groups were drawn to the places where people were suffering the most. A year later, the second city set out south toward the coast. 2 years later, the third. Ethan saw each one off while standing on the wall, and each time he felt how the connection didn't break with distance, but stretched, just as a root stretches, without losing its connection to the tree. The network of cities gave itself a simple name. The grove remained the grove, only now the word meant not a fortress, but a way of life. And Ethan himself was aging strangely and well. The root network didn't drain him as it would have drained a lone gardener, because the burden was shared by everyone. He never became a king or a director. In the city registry, his title was one that Kell had once invented as a joke, and which had taken firm root: SAWMILL Overseer. And indeed, every day he would go to the old, distant workshop where, beneath a layer of well-maintained bark, his grandfather's old press with a core inside still stood. And he would sit there alone for long stretches. He didn't work. He talked with the system, which had long since ceased to be an interface and had become something like an old friend, with his grandfather, whom he hadn't been able to catch up with during the main chapter of his life. One autumn day, in his 20th year, he brought his grandniece, Kell and Tessa's eldest daughter, to the workshop and showed her a photograph of a man in a white lab coat standing by the concrete entrance. The girl asked who it was. Ethan replied that it was the man who had stolen a seed so it wouldn't be burned. The girl thought for a moment and asked, "Then who are all the others?" Ethan looked through the open gates of the workshop toward the lively city standing there in the evening light, where Grover was arguing with the crew repairing the North Tower, which didn't need repair, but Grover found life boring without it, where Odile sat in a chair among school children on the grass, where dust rose above the road from a caravan coming from the east, and Postmaster Renner hobbled out to meet it, where Sad and Kell, now adults, stood on the distant hill, and beneath their palms the last dead strip of the district turned green, where, deep beneath it all, the elder tossed and turned quietly and contentedly, and where every evening the 2,000 first and the 7,000 who came after fell asleep, knowing that the walls were listening to them. He stroked the girl's head and replied that everything else was the garden that had grown. That same night, the system displayed a line for the last time in this story that no one had requested. It recalculated the old forecast from the first night. Back then, it had given the territory 7 days before it would be absorbed by the forest. Now it reported that the term absorption was inapplicable to the current state and offered an alternative. The forest and the city were recognized as a single organism. The forecast was favorable. There is no time limit. Ethan read the message, closed his eyes, and for the first time in 20 years, didn't build anything in his sleep. He dreamed of the old sawmill from that first night. The gates creaked under the roots, and a young, frightened guy with an axe stood in the middle of the workshop, unaware that he was taking the first step in the longest construction project of his life. In his dream, Ethan didn't give him any advice. He just looked at him from a distance and nodded. The young man would manage. He'd have someone to help him. Vela was tried in open court and sentenced to a life as an ordinary worker without access to the threads. Over the years, he became a part of the city, while the garden and Kel learned to heal the poisoned land, and the grove lived a peaceful life. Upon learning from those who came from the east that the world was full of similar catastrophes, the grove began to spawn daughter-walking cities with safe cradles based on the garden's new specifications, transforming from a fortress into a network and a way of life. Ethan remained the caretaker of the sawmill near his grandfather's core. The story came full circle with a revision of the system's initial forecast, which recognized the forest and the city as a single organism with an unlimited lifespan, and all plot lines were resolved.